Hi, I'm Luke Stanke. I'm a Senior Director of Solution Engineering at SigmaComputing.
And I'm Luke Stanke. I am our Product Evangelist at Sigma. Luke, I noticed we've got some structure for this video. We also have a cactus and something called Innovation Desert. Are we talking about the Great Southwest?
No, we're not talking about the Great Southwest. We're talking about the evolution of business intelligence today.
Very different.
Very different. And this one's a little bit more involved, so we set it up ahead of time. So above on the top, you have the timeline starting back in the 70s all the way through to present day, 2024. In the swim lanes here, we have a layer for business intelligence. There's a layer that we're going to talk about spreadsheets and databases and data warehouses. And then the layer at the bottom here is like enterprise applications as we know it.
Awesome. So really no Southwest.
No Southwest, but the desert comes into play.
Awesome.
All right. The genesis of BI started, I would argue, in 1979 with the inventions of the first spreadsheet, which was called VisiCalc. And the interesting thing about VisiCalc is it was actually on the Apple II computer, and it was the first spreadsheet application that came to be. And then it wasn't until 1985 that Microsoft came out with what we all know today, Excel. And that version of Excel actually wasn't even available on a Windows computer until a bit later. But at the time, that version of Excel only supported 16,000 rows, which was a ton back then.
Yeah, you got your database and everything all in one place.
And then it wasn't until 2007 over here that the next version, well, there's some versions in between, but the version of Excel as we know it today supported a little north of 1 million rows.
Still quite the tool. It's what the number one really business intelligence tool today.
100%, still relevant today. If your BI tool can't do what you need it to do, or you don't have time to wait for a new report or whatever, just dump it down to Excel, and then you can kind of self-service and manage it on your own.
Yeah.
So that's like the spreadsheet layer of this middle layer. We talk about databases next. One of the first databases was Oracle version 2, which was released in 1979 over here, right before 1980. Another very popular database is SQL Server. SQL Server was released initially in 1989, so we'll put it right here. Fun fact, that was actually released on Sybase OS 2, wasn't on Windows until a bit later.
Interesting,
Yep.
Especially since we all know it as it being very Windows-centric today.
And then we'll talk about some of the other databases later, but there's hundreds of databases and things that were created in kind of this era right here. Now, interestingly enough, this concept of a data warehouse was coined in 1989, right here. The coin term of data warehouse was born by a guy named Bill Inman. He's known as the father of the data warehouse. He actually wrote a book a year later that was called Building the Data Warehouse.
A very intuitive name, and led to what many of us know as the central place for data.
Exactly, right. Okay, so more on spreadsheets and databases later. Let's go down to the application layer, because things in the app's enterprise application layer definitely come into play in the evolution of business intelligence. Some of the most interesting companies down in the apps layer are, let's go with IBM, SAP, and Oracle itself. Now, IBM was founded in like the early 1900s.
That's right.
SAP was founded in the late 70s, and so was Oracle, actually.
So all sort of, despite IBM being way earlier, all sort of fit in the pre-80s era.
Yep. And then some of the more modern, you would think of them as cloud enterprise applications, didn't come to be until we saw Salesforce come into play in 1999. So we have Salesforce over here. And shortly before that, we have Google, which was founded in 1998. And Salesforce is a great example. They started as CRM for salespeople. They got into service. They got into marketing. They got into commerce.
Continue to expand. It's really portfolio. Just all 5 of these application layers are portfolio companies.
Portfolio of apps. SAP is an ERP. It's just a fancy term for a lot of apps in one.
But they all started with their humble origins in the areas that we pointed with specific technology.
Exactly. Cool. So let's move on to like the BI layer because that's what we're here to talk about in the evolution of BI.
And all of this sets up applications in the database, all set up the conversation for the history of it. And that's why it's important to lay out each of these components, because it really dictates each of the eras or modes that companies and technologies will go through.
Exactly. And a business intelligence application takes data from disparate sources. It might be an app in IBM, an app in Oracle, puts it together in this newly coined term data warehouse. And then the early Gen 1 versions of BI were often called like operational reporting. They used cube-like structures in many cases to get almost any answer that they could possibly preconceive for a business user. So the first generation of BI, there's really three predominant folks that came to be there. One of the first ones was Cognos, that really became known as Cognos in 1982. So I'm going to put that right here. Another one was Business Objects, which was around 1990. A lot of people refer to it as BobJ even today. And another one was Siebel Systems, which created Siebel Analytics. And they were founded pretty early on too, around here in the 1980s. They're known as like Siebel Systems at the time. All right, so these BI systems were prolific, they grew until the first acquisition happened, which was actually Siebel Systems in 2005. And that was acquired by Oracle, which is why those enterprise apps come into play. And BobJ was acquired by SAP in 2007. And Cognos had a really good run. They were acquired by
IBM in 2008.
So all these acquisitions happened within about 2-3 years of each other.
Yeah, and then what happens to the Siebel Analytics, BobJ, Cognos?
Yeah, so what happens is they get acquired by these enterprise application companies, and they're not really acquired for, the innovation that they created and the innovation that they would hope to continue. They are acquired for the revenue multiples and the fact that they understood that they would still be relevant many, many years out. In fact, almost every enterprise company you go to today still has one or two of these systems at play, doing enterprise operational reporting and pivot table-like functionality on top of a cube. But ultimately what happens is, over time, these companies that were acquired slowly slink down into what we call the innovation desert, right? Where the people that founded the company, they exit, and the people that kind of take over don't have that vision of where that company was meant to go.
Completely. We see the trajectory of the growth of these technologies, whether it's Cognos, BobJ, or Siebel, which eventually becomes OBIEE, as less about innovation and more about how does it help the portfolio company expand their revenue and not necessarily drive the innovation of the companies that are using the technology.
Exactly. So now, interestingly enough, around the same time that these companies were being acquired, there was new companies with a new vision for business intelligence that popped up. Namely, there was Tableau in about 2005. And then eventually there was another company called Looker that was founded in 2012. And then Microsoft, we haven't really talked about Microsoft yet, but they saw what was going on with Tableau's success and Looker's success. And they created their own kind of visualization tool called Power BI. And that was released in about 2015.
That's right. And so we end up with these new technologies that are a totally different mode of reporting, competing in this time frame with a different mode of technology. And we like to think of these eras then sort of as like, here's mode 1 occurring from the 80s through, let's call it the mid 2000s. And then we have the kickoff of, with Tableau, Looker, Power BI, a new generation, a new mode that starts to happen during this time period.
Yeah.
It was called mode 2.
And that fact was dignified by Gartner. Like they separated their BI Magic Quadrant into what they called mode 1 and mode 2. And at the time it was crazy because all these legacy technologies that had such success that were acquired were kind of kicking and screaming, saying, "You moved the goalpost on us." But the goalpost, in the NFL actually moved 3 times through its history, I think. So, things do change.
Absolutely. So we've got new technologies on the board in the early 2000s and close to 2010. What happens from there?
As they say, history repeats itself. So Tableau was fantastic. It created this kind of new visual analytics mode of concept of a self-service BI until 2019, when it was acquired by Salesforce. Same thing happened with Looker. Actually, a month before Salesforce acquired Tableau, I think it was like a month or 2, Looker was acquired by Google.
So we have this occurring. We talked a little bit about what happens to the innovation of the product. Is that happening with Salesforce, Tableau, with Google and Looker?
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to look very far online to Google it and find out Reddit articles and people criticizing where they built their careers on Tableau or Google or Looker, and they're starting to say, like, look, I don't see any sort of things that I'm excited about. It seems like Salesforce is taking over Tableau. There's no good support. And so, yeah, the innovation desert is happening. They're starting to drop down into where there's not really a lot of innovation happening. So just as there was an interesting thing happened when all these acquisitions were happening with Gen Mode 1 BI and Tableau was popping up in Looker, something else was happening in the early 2010s. In 2012, this new database layer was forming called Snowflake. And then about a year later, another one emerged called Databricks. And we all know what that is today and what that became. But the interesting thing about this new database layer is that it was in the cloud, right? Just as Salesforce and Google, started native in the cloud with apps, it wasn't until about 15 years later that we created the concept of a data warehouse in the cloud. And the computer science breakthrough that Snowflake had is that they separated compute and storage. And it runs as a service. So if you need more compute, you don't have to go through a 9-month procurement cycle to rack and stack servers to get a little bit more horsepower. Your admin can go into the console and change the t-shirt size from a medium to a large or whatever you need. Snowflake obviously had amazing success because from 2012 to 2020 when they IPO'd, it was a massive IPO. I think it was the largest IPO in tech history. And they continue to grow to this day. Databricks, while it hasn't IPO'd yet, is having great success and competing very heavily with Snowflake for the data science workloads as well as the data warehousing workloads.
When I look at this, we have sort of this catalyst of new technology that is cloud-based, but everything historically, whether it was here or even within the application layer, all these things lived on-prem. So this is a whole new way of working that we're seeing happening in the future, indicated by the color shown here. But all of these historical technologies, despite the emergence of these, were built for on-prem technologies and lived on-prem. So we see not only this innovation sort of die out, go to the desert, but also it was designed not for the cloud.
Exactly. And if it's not built from the ground up for the cloud, it's not ever going to be cloud native. So it's really hard to kind of imposter cloud if you didn't start there with your code from scratch. I think the other interesting thing is when, a lot of people understand cloud computing, but I think what they don't understand is that these things run as a service, right? You're not licensing perpetual software and installing it. It's actually a service that's up and running for you. And if that company isn't really, really good at what they do, the cost of switching to another provider, just like you could move from, Disney Plus to Netflix, and maybe not that easily, but you can move off of these Snowflake or Databricks service providers and move your data into the other one, and if you think you're going to get better service there.
So that leaves us, when I look, I see innovation that has happened within the data warehouse, database space. What's happening with business intelligence?
Yeah, I mean, what's happening is just like with what happened here when Tableau was forming as all these were getting acquired, is there's a new mode of analytics that's popping up. The difference though is that it's cloud native also, right? Just like Snowflake and Databricks is.
Architected for the cloud so that data can scale to much greater levels. We talk about what happened in 2010 roughly. We talked the era of big data. Well, guess what? Big data is at a whole nother scale of being able to operate. It needs to be able to operate at this cloud scale of a whole, again, magnitudes, orders, 10, 100 times, 1,000 times larger than what we considered big data in 2010. You need new technology. What fills the gap?
Exactly, it's Sigma. Sigma is a new BI and analytics platform built cloud natively for the cloud. And the interesting thing too is it's built for cloud warehouses, because these cloud warehouses, they solved that compute and storage problem. So why try to resolve that again? You had to do that back in the days in on-prem, bring data into cubes, bring them into extracts, use your import mode. You should no longer have to do that because it's a services economy with Snowflake, Databricks, and a few other providers that are out there.
So we have very clearly what's emerging is somewhere in this zone, it has very likely already occurred, a whole new mode that is now expanding. Mode, we'll just call it for the sake of it, a new era, mode 3 that's occurring, which is cloud-centric, but also because it's on the cloud, it becomes far more accessible to many more people in the organization. It needs to be multimodal, being able to touch and work with people of many different skills, whether it's the spreadsheet user or it's someone who writes SQL or Python, or as we think about today, with even more innovation happening where Snowflake and Databricks is focusing, is this era really of AI that's occurring where both of these technologies and additional technologies are having to evolve the work that they're doing. So whether it's spreadsheets, Python, SQL, generative, or bringing those models in, you've got to have technology that can operate at the same scale that is occurring and evolving in today's market.
Yeah, but there's one more thing that's interesting too, Luke, is that these older generations of BI that was predicated on putting data into cubes, into extracts and import mode, the data was detached from the actual warehouse because it didn't run as a service. Now the game has changed because now these warehouses are directly being queried by Sigma, but also Sigma can write back into those warehouses.
That's a feature that has not been available really other than a few fragmented players in the past.
Never really native to the technology. It was usually some sort of bolt-on or add-on to make it work. Duct tape and bubble gum.
Yes, and to have that built directly in the product where the data is flowing in both directions and remaining secure and governed at all times is unmatched in the ecosystem.
Yeah. So I'm really excited to see what's to come, right? There's this like new era where you can use BI like a spreadsheet. It can have SQL in the same modal. You can have Python, and now we're having AI where you can conversationally build your BI applications or your analyses.
Yeah, I would just also highlight the innovation that has occurred from the get-go, and really, particularly in the last 6 years, last 10 years, the amount of innovation that's having to occur and how technology is evolving to meet the needs, particularly with Sigma, on driving cloud scale, working with AI, bringing in many modes, writing back. Those are features of the industry that are now by default in demand. You have to provide them.
100%.
Until next time.
Cheers.